Series 1. Chapter 1. Really Bad Day. The full moon hung heavy over the Silverfang Pack's grand hall, casting silvery light over the gathered wolves. Tonight was supposed to be the start of everything. Her new life as Luna, her bond with Damon solidified, her place at his side undeniable. Isla stood before the Alpha, heart pounding, hands trembling at her sides. Damon reached for her, his golden eyes locked on hers. The bond should have snapped into place, a thread of energy between them, tying their souls together in a way nothing could sever. Instead, agony lanced through her. Isla gasped, doubling over as a searing pain burned through her chest, as if invisible claws were tearing at her ribcage. A choked sound escaped her lips, her fingers clawing at her skin. The hall blurred, the flickering torches streaking into smears of orange and gold. She reached for Damon, desperate, terrified. Nothing. The connection was supposed to be there, the invisible tether that would pull her into him, sealing their fate, but the space between them remained hollow, empty. The silence was worse than the pain. A beat. Then another. The quiet stretched too long, pressing in like suffocating fog before the first horrified gasp cut through the stillness. She didn't bond. A rustle of movement, wolves shifting, muttering. Someone sucked in a breath. Someone else choked out a disbelieving laugh. The noise built, rising and crashing like a wave about to break. Isla forced herself upright, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Her gaze darted to Damon. He wasn't moving. Why wasn't he moving? Her chest heaved, the pain still raw, burning under her skin like an open wound. Her body screamed for comfort, for reassurance, for him. But Damon took a step back. It was small, maybe even unconscious, but it might as well have been a death sentence. The pack's whispers turned to outright voices now, rising into a deafening hum of disbelief and judgment. What does this mean? She's unworthy. A curse, surely. No Luna in history. Never failed a mating bond. The room spun. Isla's legs wobbled, her breath hitching, her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, the soft blue material bunching beneath her nails. She'd spent weeks choosing this dress, picturing the moment Damon would mark her, how she'd finally belong. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She turned to Damon, throat tight, heart a wild thing in her chest. "Say something," she whispered, voice raw. His golden eyes flicked to her, unreadable, cold in a way she'd never seen before. Then he looked past her, over her, through her, her stomach clenched. "Damon?" She hated the way her voice broke, the way she sounded small when she was supposed to be a Luna. His jaw tensed, the muscle ticking as if he were calculating. She saw the moment he made his choice. Damon turned to the elders instead of her. A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. The oldest of the elders, a grizzled man with silver-streaked hair, stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "This has never happened before. A fated mate bond failing? It is unnatural." More voices joined in. A woman scoffed. "A Luna who cannot bond with her Alpha? She is unfit." An omen. A mistake. Isla clenched her teeth, forcing herself to stand taller. Her whole life had led to this moment, to proving she was worthy of Damon, of this pack. She had trained for this, bled for this, done everything to be the Luna they needed. Damon had chosen her. He was supposed to fight for her, yet he stood silent. His eyes never met hers. The floor beneath her felt unsteady, the world tilting as she fought the sickening realization crawling up her throat. No, this couldn't be happening. Then Leon, Damon's beta, stepped forward, his voice ringing through the chaos. "She's cursed." A hush swept the hall, suffocating. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Isla inhaled sharply, the weight of them crushing, final. Someone in the crowd hissed. Another took a step away from her. Cursed. The word wrapped around her, digging in deep. A brand, a noose tightening. Her breath hitched. Damon still said nothing. Her mate, the man she had spent years loving, training for, hoping for, stood still, watching her like she was a stranger. And that was when Isla knew. She had never truly belonged here. Isla sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers curled into the sheets, jaw locked so tight it ached. The grand hall still pulsed with the sound of celebration, laughter spilling through the thick stone walls of the Silverfang estate. It should have been her celebration. Her bond with Damon should have solidified by now. The Luna's mark should have burned its way onto her skin. Instead, nothing. No mark, no bond, no mate. Only a locked door and the sinking realization that her pack, her family, was already deciding what to do with her. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus on anything other than the thick knot of humiliation lodged in her chest. Across the room, the vanity mirror caught the glow of candlelight reflecting back a woman she barely recognized. Messy brown curls framed a face pale from shock, lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. Her hands shook, but she clenched them into fists before the weakness could take root. Outside, voices drifted up from the courtyard. She's a danger to the pack. A Luna who can't bond, it's unnatural. She hasn't done anything wrong. The bond failed, Sarah. You know what that means. A sharp bark of laughter. It means she's defective. Isla's stomach clenched. Defective. She had trained for this moment her entire life, learned every law, studied every ritual, perfected the art of standing beside an alpha without being overshadowed. And now, she was being discussed like a problem to be dealt with. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to push away the growing pressure in her skull. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a mistake. Maybe something had interfered with the bond, some magical anomaly, some ridiculous cosmic hiccup. Or maybe, a nasty voice whispered, you were never meant to be his mate. She shot to her feet, pacing across the room, forcing breath into her lungs. Her body still ached, her skin overly sensitive, like her nerves were protesting the severed connection. The room felt wrong, too small, too quiet, like the walls were pressing inward. She caught her reflection again, just for a second. And then everything shifted. The mirror warped, the air buzzed. For a single heartbeat, a silver glow outlined her body, crackling with an energy that wasn't hers. Her eyes, once deep brown, gleamed like molten silver. Then it was gone. Isla stumbled back, knocking into the nightstand. The candle wobbled, wax spilling over the edge. Her pulse roared in her ears. That wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A trick of the light, her mind playing cruel jokes after an already catastrophic night. She ran both hands through her hair, forcing out a laugh that sounded a little too much like panic. Great, she muttered, losing my mate and my sanity in the same night. Love that for me. She glared at the mirror, daring it to do something weird again. It didn't. Of course it didn't. Because Isla wasn't cursed or glowing or marked by some mysterious force. She was just exhausted, overwhelmed, possibly on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Her body sagged against the bedpost as she dragged a hand down her face. Tomorrow she'd find Damon. He'd explain everything. He had to explain everything. Maybe this was some bizarre test. Maybe the elders would perform another ceremony, try to reforge the bond. Maybe. A knock at the door sent her thoughts skidding to a halt. She straightened, heart leaping into her throat. A long pause. Then a voice, low and clipped. The elders summon you at dawn. Then footsteps and silence. She sat frozen, cold dread curling through her veins. They'd already made their decision. The council chamber was colder than it had any right to be. Isla stood in the center, shoulders squared, chin high, even as her insides twisted into knots so tight she could barely breathe. The elders sat before her, their faces carved from stone, their expressions unreadable. And Damon stood at the back, arms crossed, his golden eyes distant, unmoved. She hadn't seen him since the night of the failed bond. He hadn't sought her out, hadn't offered a single word of comfort. Now she was here, standing trial like a criminal. One of the elders, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, cleared his throat. The pack cannot afford uncertainty. His voice was calm, reasonable, like he wasn't deciding her fate with every syllable. A Luna who cannot bond with her mate disrupts the natural order. Isla's hands clenched at her sides. It wasn't my fault. We're not here to assign blame. Another elder, an older woman with sharp hawk-like features, tilted her head. We're here to discuss what happens next. Something ugly coiled in her gut. They were speaking as if she were already gone. She turned to Damon, her last lifeline, her mate. Her voice was steadier than she expected when she said, Tell them this isn't over. He said nothing. Her breath hitched. Damon, she tried again, a whisper now. Still nothing. He wasn't even looking at her. A slow, sinking horror wrapped around her ribs. He wasn't going to fight for her. She had spent years preparing for this role, training to be the Luna he needed, loving him, trusting that when it mattered, he would choose her. And now, when she needed him the most, he stepped back. Not much, barely a shift in posture, but it was enough. The elder with the hawk eyes nodded, satisfied. Then it's decided. The words buzzed in Isla's ears, the world tilting dangerously. No, this wasn't how this ended. She opened her mouth, desperate to say something to fix this, but then a touch. A slip of paper pressed against her palm, so quick, so subtle, that she almost missed it. She turned her head just enough to catch the hooded figure beside her. A woman, cloaked and unassuming, standing among the pack's lower ranks. Isla didn't recognize her, but before she could react, the woman was gone, slipping into the crowd. Heart hammering, Isla curled her fingers around the note and glanced down. The curse is a lie. Find me before it's too late. Her skin prickled. She barely had time to process before the elder spoke again, sealing her fate. You have until the next full moon to break this curse. If you fail, you will be exiled from Silverfang, permanently. The room spun. Exile. Thrown out of the only home she had ever known, cast away like a broken thing. Her gaze snapped to Damon, one last plea, one final, say something, damn it! But he was already looking past her, like she was nothing. The final thread holding her together snapped. Fine, if they wanted her gone, they would have to drag her out, kicking and screaming. Or maybe she would leave on her own. The halls of the Silverfang estate had never felt like a cage before. Isla moved through the dimly lit corridors, the voices in the main hall fading behind her. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in her room, waiting for a miracle, for an answer, for some ridiculous twist of fate that would make all of this make sense. But the walls felt too close, the air too thick, and the last thing she needed was to sit in that room and let the weight of her exile crush her. So she walked, barefoot, wearing the dress she had been meant to bond in. The soft blue fabric felt wrong against her skin now, like a cruel joke. She turned the corner toward the east wing when voices drifted from the open council chamber. She recognized them immediately. Damon. Leon. Her heartbeat picked up. She shouldn't stop. She should not stop. She stopped. Pressing herself against the wall, she focused on their hushed conversation, ears straining for every syllable. She doesn't know. Damien's voice was sharp, low. Leon exhaled. You should have told her. A pause. Then, it wouldn't have changed anything. The breath Isla had been holding lodged in her throat. She inched closer, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. Leon's tone darkened. That's not true, and you know it. She deserved to know. Before the ceremony. Cold swept through her veins. Before the ceremony. Damon knew. She swallowed hard, heart slamming against her ribs, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Leon wasn't finished. You had time to fix this, to look for answers. You chose not to. Isla clamped a hand over her mouth. Everything inside her went still, like the moment before a storm, where the world held its breath and waited for destruction. Damon knew. Her mate, the one person in the world who should have stood by her, had let her suffer alone. Her chest burned, a different kind of fire now, something raw and ugly. Damon exhaled, tired, like this conversation had drained him. What was I supposed to do, Leon? His voice was quieter now. Tell her she was never meant to be mine. The words struck like a blade. Isla's breath came too fast, her pulse roaring in her ears. She turned, walking away before she did something stupid, like storm in there and tear him apart. Like ask him why. Like beg him to love her anyway. She didn't realize she was running until she reached her room, slamming the door behind her, hands shaking. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror across the room. Her face was pale, eyes wide, lips parted as she tried to drag in a full breath. She looked wrecked. But beneath all the shock, all the betrayal, something else flickered to light. Fury. Not just at Damon, not just at the pack. At herself. She had spent her entire life preparing to be his Luna, molding herself into the perfect mate, waiting for him to see her the way she saw him, and the whole time he had known. He had looked at her, kissed her, held her, and kept this from her. He had let her believe she was broken. The paper in her palm crinkled as her fingers curled into a fist. The curse is a lie. Find me before it's too late. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the decision had already been made. She wasn't staying here to beg for a place that would never be hers. She was going to find the rogue seer, and she was going to get the truth. The moon watched as Isla ran. Her bare feet pounded against the damp earth, breath sharp in her throat. The Silverfang pack's borders stretched behind her, the towering pines swallowing her whole. The scent of rain clung to the air, thick with the promise of a storm. She had never been beyond the pack's lands alone, not once. She had grown up surrounded by warriors, by rules, by a life that was mapped out before she was even old enough to understand it. And now she was running straight into the unknown? Brilliant plan, Isla, truly. A branch snagged the hem of her dress, ripping the already tattered fabric. She didn't stop. Couldn't. If she slowed down, if she let herself think too hard, the doubt would settle in. She could still turn back, go home, pretend she never overheard Damien's betrayal, never found the note, never let herself believe there was another truth waiting to be uncovered. But home wasn't home anymore. She swallowed against the lump rising in her throat and pressed forward, deeper into the dark. The rogue seer's note had been burned into her mind for hours. The curse is a lie. Find me before it's too late. That was the only thread she had left to follow. She wasn't sure how long she had been moving before she saw it. Nestled in the heart of the woods, shrouded by curling vines and twisted roots, was a small, weather-worn hut. Her steps slowed. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, the wood sagging, the roof barely holding itself together. A single lantern flickered in the window, casting golden light across the damp ground. A breeze rustled the leaves. You gonna stand there all night? Isla nearly jumped out of her skin. The voice, scratchy, dry, amused, came from inside. She hesitated, fingers twitching at her sides. The door creaked open, revealing a hunched woman with skin like old parchment, her long silver thread black hair woven with beads and feathers, her eyes, milky and unreadable, locked onto Isla with an eerie kind of certainty. Took you long enough, the seer said, stepping aside. Come in. Isla hesitated. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run in the opposite direction. Instead, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and something older, something she couldn't name. Jars lined the shelves, filled with substances that shimmered or pulsed as though they were alive. The seer lowered herself into a chair, joints popping. Sit. Isla perched on the edge of a stool, stiff as a board. The woman studied her. Then she reached out, grasping Isla's wrist with surprising strength. A sharp inhale. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. Oh, so that's why they were afraid. Isla's skin tingled. What? The seer's grip tightened, her cloudy gaze turning inward. You were never meant to be bound, girl. The words crawled up Isla's spine. What does that mean? The old woman didn't answer. She let go of Isla's wrist, shaking her head, mouth twisting like she had tasted something bitter. Damned fool of an alpha. Keeping secrets never ends well. Isla's pulse thundered. What does that mean? The seer sighed, rolling her shoulders. It means you were never meant to be Damien's mate. You were never meant to be anyone's mate. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Her stomach churned. No. She shook her head. That's not... A tremor rumbled through the ground. The seer stilled. The shaking deepened, a slow, steady pulse, and then... a howl. Not from a wolf. Something deeper, older. The lantern's flame guttered. Isla's blood turned to ice. The seer let out a slow breath. Ah, she muttered. Well, that's not good. Chapter 5. Head in sand, Isla folded her arms, planting her feet firmly on the creaky floor of the seer's hut. No, she said flatly. The old woman raised an eyebrow. No. That's right. Isla exhaled, trying to keep her voice steady. Because what you're saying, it's insane. The seer sighed, rubbing her temples as if Isla was personally giving her a migraine. I expected resistance, but this level of denial is just embarrassing. I'm not in denial, Isla snapped. Her hands balled into fists. I came here because I thought you could help me break this curse, not whatever this is. The seer settled into her rickety chair, studying Isla with those unsettling, cloudy eyes. Tell me, girl, she said, lacing her fingers together. What exactly do you think a curse is? Isla blinked. Excuse me? A curse, a spell, a sickness, some cruel cosmic joke. What do you think it is? The old woman leaned forward. Because what you call a curse is not a curse at all. It is the shackles placed upon something greater, and you are too afraid to see it. Heat rushed to Isla's face. I'm not afraid. The seer just snorted. You are terrified. Isla's jaw clenched. She wasn't terrified. She was realistic. Because this was impossible. The seer was talking about an ancient war, about wolves who had once carried the power of the Moon Queen herself, wolves who had been too strong, too dangerous, too untamed, and so they had been bound, caged, stripped of their abilities so they could never rise again, and now, apparently, Isla was one of them. Right. Sure, any moment now the seer was going to start telling her she was secretly royalty too. You are looking for an easy answer, the old woman muttered, shaking her head. And there is none. You want a simple fix, a spell, a ceremony, a way to go running back to that Alpha of yours and pretend none of this ever happened? She tisked. You're wasting your time. Isla's breath caught. She hated how the words landed like a strike to the ribs. She did want to go back. Even after everything, even after Damien's silence, after overhearing his betrayal, after knowing he had given up on her, she wanted to fix it. She wanted to stand at his side and take the place she had spent her whole life preparing for. But that was the problem, wasn't it? The place she had trained for had never been hers to begin with. She swallowed hard. I don't care about some ancient war or forgotten wolves or fate. Her voice wavered, just enough for the seer's eyes to sharpen. I just want my life back. The old woman studied her for a long moment, then, without a word, she reached into a wooden chest beside her chair and pulled something free. A dagger. It was old, worn, the silver blade dulled with age, the handle wrapped in cracked leather. This, the seer said, holding it out, belonged to another before you. She was like you. She denied her destiny. And do you know what happened to her? Isla hesitated. She died? Of course she died, the old woman snapped, but not before she suffered. Because the universe does not take kindly to those who refuse the path set before them. The weight of the dagger settled into Isla's palm. It was heavier than it looked. She stared at it, her fingers tightening around the handle. A deep breath, then the hut shook. Isla staggered back, her heart leaping to her throat as a blast of heat surged through the room. The seer's eyes widened, nostrils flaring. Ah, she muttered. That's not good. A split second later, the walls burst into flames. Underscore, 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 underscore. Chapter 6. Pull-out rug Isla ran. The seer was fast for an old woman. moving through the trees like she had done this 1,000 times before. Isla didn't ask where they were going. She just followed, lungs burning, adrenaline coursing through her veins as the glow of the fire turned the night sky orange. Behind them, something howled, and it was not a wolf. The seer skidded to a stop beside a rocky outcrop, grabbing Isla's arm in an iron grip. "We're being hunted," she said, voice tight. "We need to move." Isla opened her mouth to ask by what, to demand what the hell was happening, to scream. But then the wind shifted. A familiar scent hit her nose. Her stomach dropped. Silverfang, no, this wasn't. She turned just as figures emerged through the smoke. 3 warriors, wearing her pack's crest. Her breath caught. "Damon sent them," she whispered. The realization settled like ice in her chest. Not just hunters. Not just some unknown enemy, her own people. The seer's grip on her wrist tightened. "You still think you're meant to go back to them?" she hissed. Isla couldn't answer, because the lead warrior, one she had grown up with, trained with, was already reaching for her, voice sharp with authority. "Come with us, Isla, now." She didn't move. She couldn't move, until her packmate, her friend, looked at her with something cold. Distant, foreign. Orders. He was following orders. Her fingers curled into fists. Damon wouldn't. And then, as if summoned by her own desperation, Damian's voice slammed through the pack bond. "Calm. Final. You should have stayed quiet." The bond snapped. Her knees nearly buckled. She had thought, despite everything, he wouldn't go this far. That maybe some part of him still... But no. Damon had chosen, and it wasn't her. A hollow silence filled her chest. She wasn't going back. Not now, not ever. The choice was made before she even opened her mouth. She turned to the seer, her voice steady. "Teach me." Act 2, Chapter 7. Enemies and Allies. The wilderness stretched endlessly before Isla, vast and untamed, the scent of pine and damp earth thick in the air. It was nothing like the well-patrolled Silverfang lands where familiar trails guided every step. Here, the ground was uneven, the shadows longer, the sounds of unseen creatures rustling through the underbrush keeping her on edge. Mora trudged ahead, moving through the dense terrain with the ease of someone who had long stopped fearing it. Isla, on the other hand, was struggling. Her boots caught on roots, her legs ached, and despite her shifter blood, exhaustion settled in her bones. "This would be easier if we stopped for food," she muttered, pushing a branch out of her way, only for it to snap back and smack her in the face. Mora didn't slow. "And it would be easier if you weren't soft," Isla bristled. "I'm not..." The older woman shot her a look over her shoulder. "When was the last time you hunted?" Isla's mouth opened, then closed. Mora scoffed. "That's what I thought." Heat flared beneath Isla's skin, frustration curling in her gut. She had trained her whole life to be a Luna, to lead, to rule, not to scavenge for food like some rogue. But that was exactly what she was now, wasn't it? They walked in silence for hours, the weight of everything pressing heavier with each step. By the time the trees thinned and a jagged mountain ridge came into view, Isla was running on fumes. Mora finally stopped, rolling her shoulders. "We're here." Isla followed her gaze, eyes widening. Nestled between the cliffs and a winding river was a settlement unlike anything she'd seen before. Makeshift huts and tents clustered together, warriors sharpening weapons by a roaring fire. Wolves prowled between the buildings, some half-shifted, their glowing eyes tracking her movements. This was the rebel camp, a sanctuary for exiled wolves, rogues, and those deemed unworthy by pack laws. A place that should have been nothing but a story to her, and now she was standing in the middle of it. A man stepped forward from the crowd, arms crossed, head tilting as he took her in. Cassian. Even if Mora hadn't mentioned him, Isla would have known he was in charge. He carried himself with the easy confidence of an alpha, except his power wasn't like Damian's. It didn't smother the air, didn't demand submission. It dared her to meet it head-on. "Silverfang," he mused, his hazel eyes narrowing. "Didn't think I'd ever see one of your kind crawling into my camp." Isla stiffened. "I'm not one of them." "Really?" He smirked. You smell like them. Her jaw clenched. Mora stepped between them. She is here to train. Cassian's gaze flicked to the older woman. And you think we should waste our resources on a pampered little Luna who doesn't know how to survive a day outside her pack's walls? Isla's hands curled into fists. He was testing her. She had spent years schooling her face into careful neutrality, but that didn't work here. These wolves thrived on rawness, on instinct. So when Cassian raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening, Isla straightened. "Give me a chance," she said. "I'll prove I belong." His lips twitched. "Good." He turned to the watching wolves. "Who wants to fight her?" Her stomach dropped. A chorus of eager growls filled the camp. Oh, shit. Cassian stepped back, and before Isla could protest, a wolf lunged. She reacted too slowly. 1 second she was standing, and the next she was flat on her back, dirt in her mouth, a knee pressed hard against her chest. Pain radiated through her ribs. Her attacker, an olive-skinned woman with braided hair and a wicked grin, leaned down. "This isn't a pack ceremony, princess," she purred. "We don't hold back here." Then she shoved off, leaving Isla gasping for breath. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Humiliation burned in her veins, but more than that, rage. She scrambled to her feet, shoulders heaving. Cassian tilted his head. "You done?" "No, not yet." She lunged again, moving on instinct this time, and while she didn't win, she lasted. Barely. By the end, she was a mess of bruises, chest heaving, but standing. Cassian studied her for a long moment. Then, just as he turned away, Mora's voice rang through the night. "She is more than just a failed Luna." Isla swallowed hard as Mora's eyes gleamed. "She is a silver wolf." Silence fell over the camp, and just like that, everything changed. Underscore, 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 underscore. Chapter 8. Games and Trials. The rebel camp was alive with movement, the sharp clang of metal against metal ringing through the air. Isla stood at the edge of the training grounds, muscles sore from the night before. She had survived her first fight. Now came the real challenge. Cassian had agreed to let her stay, but not as a guest. If she wanted their protection, their knowledge, she had to earn it. Which was how she found herself standing across from Kai, her new trainer, and, judging by the way he looked at her worst nightmare. Kai was all sharp edges and careless smirks, a dagger twirling between his fingers. "All right, princess," he drawled. "Let's see what you've got." "I told you not to call me that," he grinned. "Do something about it, then." Heat flared under her skin, but she forced herself to focus. She had trained before. She knew how to fight, but as Kai lunged, she realized this was nothing like what she had been taught. The rebels didn't fight like the Silverfang warriors, all form and precision. They fought dirty, unpredictable, ruthless. She hesitated for half a second. That was all it took. The next thing she knew, she was on her back again, Kai crouching beside her with a lazy smirk. "You really were sheltered, huh?" She glared at him. But he wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about fighting. It was about unlearning. About tearing down everything she thought she knew and starting from scratch. She failed, again and again, but she got back up. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, her body ached, her knuckles raw. But something inside her had shifted, and when Kai dragged her into the woods that night for a survival test, forcing her to track and take down prey with nothing but her instincts, she felt it. Her senses sharpened, her vision cutting through the darkness in ways it never had before. Something was waking inside her, and when she returned to the camp, victorious, Mora watched her with a knowing look. "The Moon Queen is watching, child," she murmured. "And she is waiting." The scent of blood and pine still clung to Isla's skin as she stepped into the rebel camp, her pulse steady, her breath even. She had done it. She had hunted. Killed. Survived. The weight of the carcass she had dragged back earlier had long since been lifted from her shoulders, but the weight of what it meant still pressed against her ribs. She wasn't a pampered Luna anymore, and the others knew it too. She felt the shift the moment she entered the clearing. Wolves who had ignored her before now met her gaze. A few even nodded. Small gestures, but they meant everything. The rebels respected strength, not titles. She had spent her whole life being told who she was supposed to be, and for once, she was being seen for something she had done. Cassian leaned against the wooden fighting post, arms crossed, watching her with mild interest. "Word is you didn't completely embarrass yourself out there." Isla rolled her shoulders. "Try not to sound too proud." His mouth twitched. "I don't do proud. But I do believe in momentum. Let's see if you can keep yours." He pushed off the post, clapping his hands together. "Sparring match, 3-on-3. You, Kai, and Lyra against Jax, Tomas, and Ilara. No rules." Kai groaned. "Why do I have to be on her team?" "Because you're annoying and I like watching you suffer," Cassian said easily. Lyra, the same rogue who had wiped the floor with Isla on her first night, grinned. "Try to keep up, princess." The title should have grated, but this time it wasn't filled with mockery, more like a challenge. Isla smirked. "Don't slow me down, then." The fight started fast. Jax lunged at her, aiming high, but Isla moved. Not in the way she had before, all hesitation and second-guessing. No, this time she was already stepping aside before his fist could connect. She saw the way his muscles tensed, the way his weight shifted on his back foot. He had overcommitted, left himself open. She took the opening. Her fist slammed into his ribs, her knee coming up an instant later to knock him off balance. Jax hit the ground hard. A sharp whistle cut through the air. "Well, damn," Kai muttered. Ilara and Tomas hesitated for a fraction of a second, but that was all Kai and Lyra needed. Kai flipped over Tomas, using his momentum to send him crashing into Ilara. Lyra swept in, fast and brutal, driving her opponent into the dirt. It was over. Fast. Breathless, Isla stood at the center of the training grounds, hands still curled into fists, heart hammering. For the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was exhilarating. Not because she had bested Jax. Not because she had won. Because it had felt right, like she was meant for this. A slow clap started. Cassian. That was unexpected, he admitted, eyes sharp with something new. Consideration. Not bad, Silverfang. A thrill shot through her chest. Lyra nudged her with an elbow. Might just make a rogue out of you yet. Kai grumbled something about beginner's luck, but even he looked at her differently now. She had earned this. Not with a title, not with a name, with her own strength. The moment was shattered by a sharp intake of breath. Mora stood at the edge of the clearing, her face set in grim lines. "They're coming." Silence fell. Cassian's expression darkened. "Damien's wolves?" She nodded. The weight of it pressed down, cold and sharp. "They've found us." The warning came too late. One moment the rebel camp was settling in for the night, fires crackling, wolves sharpening blades or laughing over half-eaten meals. The next, the air split with snarls and the unmistakable scent of Silverfang warriors. Chaos erupted. Wolves lunged from the shadows, their movements swift and precise, the kind of discipline Isla knew all too well. This wasn't a warning attack. It was an extermination. Cassian's rebels met them head-on, the night filling with the clash of steel, the snap of bone, the raw fury of battle. Isla's pulse pounded as she spun in the confusion, instincts warring inside her. She wasn't ready for this. Something slammed into her back, nearly knocking her to the ground. She turned just as a dagger was shoved into her grip. "Kai!" His green eyes burned. "You wanted to prove yourself? Now's your chance." He didn't wait for her response before diving into the fight. Isla gripped the blade, her fingers tightening around the worn handle. The weight was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Then she saw them. Wolves she had trained beside, and now they were coming for her. A blonde warrior lunged, recognition flashing across his face. "Isla!" She didn't hesitate. Her body moved, fluid and fast, her blade catching his wrist, twisting him off balance. He hit the dirt with a stunned grunt, eyes wide with something between disbelief and betrayal. She had no time to process it. Another came at her, then another. She met them all. Not with hesitation, not with fear, with instinct. Everything she had been trained for, everything she had learned from the rebels, it clicked. She ducked low, dodging a strike meant to take her head off, and countered with a kick to the ribs. Someone howled in pain. The scent of blood, sharp, metallic, coiled in her lungs, but she didn't falter. She had spent her whole life preparing to defend her pack. Now she was fighting against it. A shadow loomed, and suddenly Leon was in front of her, his broad form blocking out the chaos. His lip curled. "You should have stayed where you belonged." She barely had time to react before he was on her. Leon had always been strong, fast, relentless, but so was she. He aimed for her ribs. She twisted. He grabbed for her wrist. She ducked under his grip. Their movements were a dance, rehearsed over years of sparring, except this time, there was no laughter, no pulled punches, only war. Leon snarled as she slipped past his defenses, landing a solid hit to his ribs. He stumbled, eyes flashing. This wasn't the same girl who had stood before the elders, waiting for judgment. She had been thrown out, hunted, betrayed, and now she was winning. Leon fell to one knee, breathing hard, his expression flickering between fury and something softer. Pity, maybe. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped. Isla met his gaze, her own breath steady. "It changes everything." The battlefield rang with dying cries, the rebels pushing the Silverfang warriors back. The tide was turning. And then, a howl. Deep, dark, commanding. The battlefield froze. Isla's blood went cold as a massive black wolf emerged from the trees, golden eyes locking onto her. Damon had arrived. The battlefield stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Damon stepped forward, his massive black wolf shrinking and shifting until he stood in his human form. The moonlight caught the edges of his bare skin, illuminating muscles carved by years of dominance. His golden eyes, predatory, unreadable, locked onto Isla like a hunter watching prey that had strayed too far. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to move, to run. But she held her ground, breathing hard, her fingers still curled around the hilt of her dagger. "Isla." His voice was steady, calm, as if he weren't standing in the middle of a war zone, as if the bodies around them didn't matter. She said nothing. His head tilted, studying her the way one might examine a puzzle missing its last piece. Then he took another step, gaze sweeping over her disheveled state. Bruised knuckles, wild hair, the undeniable scent of rebellion clinging to her skin. A soft sigh escaped him, almost pitying. "You were never meant for this life." Something deep in her chest clenched. She had spent years hearing those words in one way or another, spoken softly when she wasn't strong enough in training, whispered behind her back when she tried to prove herself, too delicate, too polished, too much a Luna to ever be a warrior. Once, she might have believed him, but that girl was dead. She lifted her chin. And yet, here I am. His expression didn't change, but something darkened in his eyes. "You don't have to do this." He stepped closer, voice lowering. "Come back, leave this behind, and I will call off the hunt." A hollow laugh escaped her. "This?" She gestured to the rebels behind her, the wolves who had taken her in when her own pack cast her out. "You mean the people who didn't betray me?" His jaw tensed, but his voice remained infuriatingly patient. "You belong with me, Isla. With Silverfang." No. She had spent her life waiting for him to choose her, for her pack to accept her, for a place that was never really hers. But she wasn't waiting anymore. She shook her head, grip tightening around her blade. "I will never go back." The words settled between them like a blade sinking into flesh. Damien's patience snapped. His golden eyes burned. So be it. Then he moved. Fast, too fast. Isla barely had time to raise her dagger before his hand closed around her wrist, twisting her arm back with brutal efficiency. Pain lanced through her shoulder as she struggled against his grip. "You're not ready for this," he growled, voice edged with something close to frustration. "You know you're not." She bared her teeth, throwing her weight into a counterattack, but he dodged with ease, knocking her legs out from under her. She hit the ground hard, gasping. Damon loomed over her. Last chance. Rage flared inside her, hot and wild. She ignored the ache in her limbs, forcing herself up. "I'd rather die than be yours." For a split second, something flickered in his expression. Then he lunged. She braced for impact. But before he could reach her, Cassian was there, slamming into Damon and knocking him back. "Move," he barked, barely sparing her a glance as he fought to hold the Alpha off. Kai grabbed her arm, yanking her away from the chaos. "We're getting out of here." "No," she protested, twisting against his grip. She wasn't running, not again. But then she saw the battle turning. The rebels were holding their own, but for how long? Silverfang warriors swarmed through the camp like a tide, and Damon was stronger, faster than any of them. They couldn't win this. Not tonight. Her stomach lurched as Kai dragged her toward the tree line, the rebels retreating into the shadows. And then, Damon's voice cut through the night, low, final. "Run all you want. I will always find you." A shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't over, not even close. The underground sanctuary smelled like damp earth and blood. Isla sat against the rough stone wall, knees drawn up, her body aching from the battle she hadn't been strong enough to finish. The rebels moved around her, patching wounds, reinforcing barricades, whispering about what had just happened, but their voices blurred, drowned by the single thought thrumming in her head. Damon knew. He had always known. Her hand tightened around the blood-stained fabric of her shirt, pressing against the bruised ribs beneath. Her mind replayed his words from the battlefield, the calm certainty in them. "Run all you want. I will always find you." She wanted to tear the words out of her skull, erase the way they coiled around her like chains, but before she could drown in them, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. "Mora." The old seer lowered herself onto a wooden crate, watching Isla with unreadable eyes. "You were never cursed," she said without preamble. Isla's pulse jumped. Mora leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "You want the truth? Fine. The reason your bond with Damon failed wasn't because you were broken. It was because you were never meant to be bound to him at all." The air thickened. Isla forced a breath into her lungs. "What are you saying?" "You are not just any wolf, girl," Mora said, voice sharp. "You are a silver wolf." The words slammed into her. She almost laughed, almost told the woman to take her cryptic nonsense somewhere else. But something inside her paused, because deep down she knew it was true. Mora must have seen it in her face because she nodded. The silver wolves were the strongest of our kind, blessed by the Moon Queen herself, but their power was too great, too wild. It threatened the balance. So she bound them. She sealed their abilities away, forcing them to prove themselves before they could awaken. Isla shook her head, trying to shove down the panic rising in her throat. "No, I was supposed to be a Luna. I trained my whole life for what?" Mora cut in. "To be a trophy? A mate gifted to an Alpha who is afraid of what you truly are?" The words sent a sharp jolt through her. Mora's lips pressed into a grim line. Damon knew Isla. He knew from the beginning. A cold wave crashed over her. She barely heard the rest of Mora's explanation. That Damon had chosen to keep it from her. That he had let her believe she was cursed rather than risk her growing into something stronger than him. Everything between them, every moment, every whispered promise, every touch, had been built on a lie. Her fingers twitched, and a strange sensation crackled beneath her skin. She looked down. A faint glow curled along her fingertips, silver and pulsing, like something waking up after a long sleep. Her breath hitched. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Underscore, 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 underscore. The air in the rebel camp was heavy with wolves moved quickly, reinforcing defenses, sharpening weapons. No one questioned that another attack was coming. They were preparing for war. Isla stood at the edge of it all, heart pounding. Mora's words echoed in her head. You cannot hide anymore. The choice sat in front of her like a dagger waiting to be picked up. If she accepted this, if she truly embraced what she was, there would be no going back. She wouldn't be Isla, the failed Luna. She wouldn't be the woman who had spent her whole life trying to fit into a role that was never meant for her. She would be something else, something unknown. But if she didn't accept it, she would die. She would lose, and she was so damn tired of losing. The weight of every choice, every betrayal, every moment that had led her here settled inside her. She exhaled slowly. Then she stepped into the center of the camp. Wolves turned. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. I will no longer run, she said. I will fight. A hush fell over them. Then Mora nodded, something knowing in her expression. As the moon rose above them, silver light wrapped around Isla's body. Warm, powerful. The silver wolf was waking. The moon hung heavy over the rebel camp, silver light pooling over the clearing where Isla stood, breath steady, hands curled into fists. The night air was thick with the scent of sweat and earth, the sounds of training filling the space around her. Grunts, the clash of steel, the dull thud of bodies hitting the dirt. She had been at it for hours. Her muscles burned, her lungs ached, but she didn't stop. Not when Kai came at her again, his dagger a blur in the moonlight. Not when she spun, dodging the blade by a hair's breadth before countering, her own dagger slicing through the air, aimed, controlled, precise. Kai barely managed to block in time. When he stepped back, breathing hard, something flashed across his face. Not annoyance, not mockery, something close to respect. The realization sent a thrill down her spine. She had spent weeks breaking down the girl she used to be, the one who hesitated, the one who second-guessed, the one who had spent her whole life waiting for someone else to decide her fate. That girl was gone. The rebels saw it. The way they watched her now, the way they moved around her, it was different. She was no longer just Damien's rejected mate or the girl who didn't belong. She was something else, something more. Mora stood at the edge of the training ground, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Finally, she stepped forward, her sharp gaze sweeping over the gathered wolves. She is ready, Mora announced. Silence rippled through the group. Kai let out a low whistle. Damn, that means she actually impressed you. Isla rolled her eyes, but her chest tightened. Mora rarely gave praise. The older woman met Isla's gaze, something unreadable flickering in her milky eyes. The time has come to choose. A shiver traced down Isla's spine. Mora pulled the silver dagger from her belt, the same one she had given Isla that night in the hut. She held it out, waiting. The moment you accept this, you will never be the same. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Isla knew what she was asking. To step forward meant fully embracing what she was. It meant there was no more pretending, no more grasping at the life she had once wanted, but there was no hesitation left inside her. She reached out, fingers closing around the hilt of the dagger, then, without breaking Mora's gaze, she lowered it to the ground and carved a deep line into the dirt at her feet. The air hummed. A strange electric pulse rippled outward, lifting the hair on her arms. It was as if the very earth was watching. She inhaled, steady, sure. Then I stepped forward. Mora's lips curled at the edges, something almost like pride flashing across her face. A howl split the night. The tension snapped. A scout stumbled into the clearing, breathless, wide-eyed. Damien's forces, he panted. They're closing in. The hum in the air turned to ice. Isla's pulse pounded. The war was here. The rebel camp was alive with movement, every wolf preparing for war. The air pulsed with urgency, but this time, Isla wasn't on the outside looking in. She wasn't a lost Luna searching for a place to belong. She was leading. She strode through the camp, her steps sure, her body thrumming with purpose. Wolves, who had once doubted her, now turned as she passed, waiting for orders. The weight of it should have felt suffocating. Instead, it settled into her bones like it had always been there, waiting for her to claim it. Cassian met her at the training circle, arms crossed, watching the camp shift into battle readiness. His hazel eyes flicked to her, unreadable. "You know what's coming, don't you?" She nodded, his jaw tightened. "And you know what you'll have to do," she swallowed. He didn't look away. "If Damon comes for you, he won't be holding back. Are you ready to put him down if you have to?" A cold knot formed in her stomach. Damon. She had spent years loving him, waiting for him to see her. Even after everything, some part of her had clung to the idea that there had been something real between them. But the man who had once held her like she was his future was now hunting her like she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. There was no going back. "I will do what I must," she said, voice steady. Cassian studied her for a beat longer, then nodded. "Then let's make sure you survive this." They gathered around the war table, a crude map spread across the surface. Mora traced her gnarled fingers over the inked lines, eyes sharp. "A direct assault would be foolish. They outnumber us." "We don't need brute force," Isla said. "We need strategy." She turned to Kai, who was already grinning. "Sabotage," he guessed. She nodded. "If we cut off their supplies, we weaken them before the real fight even starts." Kai tapped his fingers against his chin. "Bold, reckless, a little bit insane." Cassian smirked. "Sounds like a solid plan." The strategy formed quickly. Kai and Isla would lead a small group behind enemy lines, targeting their resources while Cassian's forces prepared for the larger attack. It was dangerous. It was necessary. As the others dispersed, Isla slipped away from the noise, her feet carrying her toward the small pool near the edge of camp. The water shimmered under the moonlight, still and quiet. She knelt, staring at her reflection. She expected to see the same woman who had been cast out of Silverfang, but the face that stared back at her was different, stronger. A faint glow shimmered at her fingertips, tracing silver paths over her skin. It should have unsettled her. Instead, it felt like home. She inhaled deeply, the cold air filling her lungs. "I am no longer his." The words settled over her like a vow. Then, the sound of a horn shattered the night. The enemy was here. Underscore, 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 underscore. The world was eerily still. The rebels stood in position, waiting. Every heartbeat, every breath felt like the last moment before a storm. Isla stood at the front, hands steady, mind sharp. Kai leaned against a tree beside her. "I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified by how calm you look right now." She exhaled slowly. "It's not calm. It's focus." He grinned, fancy way of saying, "I'm definitely panicking on the inside, but all right." A distant howl cut through the silence. It was time. She and Kai slipped into the shadows, their small team following closely. The enemy's camp wasn't far. Torches lined the outskirts, illuminating the figures of wolves preparing for battle. The closer they got, the harder it was to ignore the familiar faces. Wolves she had once trained with, fought beside, laughed with, and now they were the enemy. A sliver of doubt curled in her gut, but she shoved it down. She had made her choice. They reached the supply tent undetected, Kai and the others moving swiftly to sabotage the stored weapons and provisions. But just as Isla turned to signal their retreat, a sound stopped her cold. A voice. Soft, young, familiar. She spun. A boy, barely old enough to shift, stood frozen in the entrance of the tent, his wide brown eyes locked onto hers, horror spreading across his face. He knew her. She knew him. His mouth parted. "You're a traitor." The words hit harder than any blade. For a second, just a second, everything around her disappeared. Then Kai stepped beside her, pressing a dagger into her palm. "Decide." The dagger felt too heavy in Isla's grip. The boy in front of her, no older than 15, stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. He had always been one of the younger trainees back in Silverfang, eager and desperate to prove himself. He had once begged her to teach him how to throw a proper punch, and now he was looking at her like she was a monster. "You're a traitor," he had said. Maybe he believed it. Maybe a part of her still did too. Kai's voice was sharp at her ear. "He's seen us. We can't let him go." Isla knew what he meant. Loose ends got people killed. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she tightened her grip on the dagger. Her fingers trembled. Then, slowly, she lowered it. "Take his weapons. Tie him up." Kai's breath came out hard and fast, somewhere between a scoff and a growl. "Seriously? He's just a kid." She turned to face him fully. "I won't kill someone who hasn't even had a choice in this war." Kai's expression hardened. "Mercy gets you killed." "Maybe," she said, voice steady. "But I'm not Damien." The words sat between them, sharp as steel. Kai clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. Cassian, who had been watching quietly, finally spoke. "Fine," he said, nodding toward one of the rebels. "Tie him up and leave him with the others." Kai muttered something under his breath, but didn't push it. The tension didn't fade, though. The other rebels had seen what happened. Some looked relieved. Others looked wary. She had made her choice, but she would have to live with the consequences. The sky was bleeding red by the time the battle began. The Silverfang forces were regrouping, their warriors pressing toward the rebels' main defenses. Isla's orders had been clear. Cut off their command, and the pack would fall into disarray, which meant one thing. Leon, Damien's beta, his most loyal soldier, and the man Isla had once trusted with her life. She found him in the heart of the battlefield, issuing orders, his dark gaze scanning for weakness. He hadn't seen her yet. Good. She stepped forward. "Leon." He turned at the sound of her voice, and something passed over his face. Shock, relief, then grim determination. "You shouldn't be here," he said, drawing his sword. Isla lifted her own blade. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Leon exhaled, shaking his head. "They got to you, didn't they?" She clenched her jaw. "No one got to me, Leon. I made my own choice." His stance shifted, shoulders squaring. "Did you?" His voice was quieter now, because the Isla I knew wouldn't have turned on her own pack. "That's the problem," she shot back. "I was never given a choice. Damien knew what I was. He lied to me. He let me believe I was broken." Leon's jaw twitched. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Silence. His hesitation cost him. Isla moved first. She lunged, her blade slicing through the air. Leon blocked just in time, steel clashing against steel. The impact sent a jolt up her arms, but she didn't let up. They moved in a deadly rhythm, attacking, blocking, countering. Leon was good. She was better. Her strength, her speed, her instincts. They were sharper now. She wasn't the same wolf he had trained beside. And he knew it. His movements grew more desperate, his strikes sloppier. Isla feinted left, then drove her knee into his ribs, sending him sprawling onto the ground. She pinned him before he could recover, her dagger pressing against his throat. Leon's chest heaved, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You were supposed to be our Luna," he whispered. Isla swallowed hard. "I was never supposed to be his." The battle raged around them, but in that moment only silence remained. The battlefield stank of blood and desperation. For a fleeting moment, Isla thought they were winning. Silverfang warriors were scattering. Cassian's rebels pushed forward, driving them back, their movements fueled by grit and defiance. The tide was shifting, and Isla, breathless, blade dripping, believed they might actually pull this off. Then the air changed. A slow, rippling tension spread through the clearing, like the forest itself was bracing for impact. Wolves hesitated mid-strike, heads snapping toward the tree line. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if it knew what was coming. Then he stepped into the clearing. Damien. He moved without urgency, his golden eyes sweeping the battlefield, assessing. The very ground seemed to bow beneath his presence, his power a tangible weight pressing against Isla's skin. Everything in her screamed run. Instead, she stood her ground, gripping her dagger tighter, forcing air into her lungs. Cassian broke first. He lunged, blade flashing. Fast, strong. Damon was faster. He sidestepped the attack with almost lazy precision, catching Cassian's wrist mid-strike. A sharp twist, a sickening crack. Cassian roared, dropping to one knee as Damon flung him aside like he was nothing, a blur of movement. Kai, reckless as always, launching himself at Damon with a snarl. Damon caught him midair and slammed him into the dirt. Isla's breath hitched as Kai coughed, body curling inward. He didn't get up. The panic clawing at her ribs hardened into rage. Damon. His head turned, slow, deliberate, and then he was walking toward her, battle raging around them, but for a terrifying moment it felt like there was only him. Only them. His voice was calm, as sharp and certain as a blade. "Come home, Isla." The words hit harder than any strike. A ghost of a memory rose, unbidden. Late nights in Silverfang's grand hall. His arm slung around her waist, lips at her ear. "You are mine, Isla." She had believed him then. She didn't believe him now. Her grip tightened on her dagger. His eyes darkened. Then he moved. She barely registered it before the impact hit. His palm slammed against her chest. Not with claws, not with teeth, but with raw, crushing power. The force shattered through her. She flew backward, slamming into the ground hard enough to steal the breath from her lungs. Her skull cracked against the dirt, stars bursting in her vision. Pain. So much pain. She gasped, struggling to rise, but her limbs wouldn't obey. Every nerve in her body screamed, her ribs pulsing with agony. Damon loomed over her, golden eyes unreadable. "I warned you," he said softly. Then darkness swallowed her whole. Isla woke to silence, not the eerie quiet of a battlefield where the dead still whispered in the wind. This was different. Heavy. Controlled. Rump. Her wrists ached. She tugged, only to feel the cold bite of iron against her skin. Shackles. Her eyes snapped open. She was back in Silverfang territory. The room was painfully familiar. Damon's war chamber, the one she had stood in countless times before, planning border patrols, hearing battle reports. Except now, she wasn't standing at his side. She was the enemy. And Damon, he was sitting across from her, golden eyes steady, hands clasped over his knee like they were having a conversation, and not whatever this was. "You should never have left," he said, his voice smooth, confident, final. Isla forced down the spike of panic rising in her throat. "Funny," she said, testing the limits of her restraints. "I don't remember asking for your opinion." His lips twitched, but there was no humor in his expression. "You always had a sharp tongue. I used to like that about you," she scoffed. "That was before I realized you only liked it when I agreed with you." Damon sighed, as if she was the one being unreasonable. "Isla, look where this has gotten you." He gestured around the room. "You fought so hard to escape me, and yet here you are, back where you belong." Something sharp curled in her gut, but she refused to let it show. "You don't get to decide where I belong." He leaned forward slightly, studying her. "Don't I?" The weight of his words pressed against her ribs, suffocating in their certainty. This was the mind game. He wouldn't kill her. Not yet. He wanted her to break, to surrender, to fold herself back into the mold he had so carefully shaped for her. But she wasn't that girl anymore. "You think you've won," she said quietly, his head tilted. "Haven't I?" "No, not yet." Because if he still had to convince her to stay, if he still needed her to choose him, then she wasn't beaten. Not yet. Damon stood, stepping closer, his presence a smothering weight. "You are strong, Isla, stronger than any Luna before you, but with me, you could be unstoppable." The words dripped with promise, an invitation wrapped in chains. "You mean controllable," she corrected. His jaw tightened. She smiled, sharp and humorless. "That's why you kept it from me, isn't it? You knew what I was before I did, and it terrified you." He didn't answer. She leaned forward as far as her restraints would allow. "I was never yours to control." Something in his expression cracked, and for the first time, Isla realized he wasn't just angry. He was afraid. The thought sent a thrill through her, sparking something deep inside. Mora's words echoed in her head. "The Moon Queen bound your power because it was too great. What if she unleashed it?" Heat coiled in her chest, bright and electric. It surged through her veins, waking something deep, something old. The shackles rattled. The air shifted. Damon took a step back. Good. She closed her eyes, let the power rise, let it consume. Then the world exploded. Underscore, 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 underscore. Everything burned. Isla hit the ground hard, body racked with pain as the room shuddered around her. She gasped, struggling to move, but her limbs felt wrong, heavy, sluggish. She had tried to tap into her power, and it had devoured her. Damon stood over her, golden eyes glowing, his stance unshaken. "You still don't know what you are," he murmured. Her breath came in ragged gasps, heart pounding as she tried to push herself up. He crouched beside her, voice deceptively soft. "You think power alone is enough? That you can just wake up one day and wield it?" He shook his head. "That's not how this works, Isla." She wanted to fight. She wanted to scream, but she could do nothing, not as he leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You can't win," he whispered. "You were never meant to." Outside, the battle raged on. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt powerless. Darkness wrapped around Isla, thick and suffocating. Pain coiled through her body, deep and gnawing. But it was nothing compared to the hollowness in her chest. The weight of Damon's words still clung to her skin. Suffocating, relentless. "You can't win." Her fingers twitched against the cold stone floor. She wanted to fight, wanted to tear herself free, but her body refused to listen. Then, a voice. Not Mora's, not Damon's, something older. "Remember." A shudder tore through her. The darkness cracked, splitting like a fault line. Images poured into her mind, too fast, too bright, like a flood of memories that had never been hers. Silver wolves, not myths, not legends. Real. She saw them. Running across the land, their bodies gleaming under the light of the full moon. Untamed, powerful. She felt their rage, their sorrow, their betrayal. The war had not been about balance. It had been about fear. The Moon Queen had not cursed them. She had sealed them. And Isla had been one of them. Her breath caught, her chest tightening as the pieces locked into place. This was never about fate. It was about control. And Damon, he had known. From the beginning, he had known. Her pulse roared in her ears as the past crashed into her like a wave. He had never intended to love her. He had never intended to let her be his equal. He had wanted to contain her. A hollow, shattering feeling spread through her chest, twisting every memory, every touch, every whispered promise. He had chosen to keep her small. Her hands clenched. Rage rose inside her, but it wasn't wild, burning fury. It was something colder, sharper. A predator's rage. The silver glow inside her pulsed, deep and ancient. The power she had tried to reach before, fumbling, desperate, was no longer out of reach. It had always been there. It had been waiting. Her silver eyes snapped open. The bonds holding her shattered like glass. Smoke curled through the ruins of the rebel camp, thick and acrid, choking the air with the scent of charred wood and blood. The ground was slick with mud, streaked with red. Bodies lay scattered where they had fallen, some rebels, some Silverfang warriors. But all of them were losses. Isla knelt in the center of it all, her hands pressed into the dirt, her breath ragged. They had lost, not just the battle, everything. Cassian was gone, his fate unknown. Kai had been injured, dragged away by the enemy. The rebels, what was left of them, had been hunted down, their forces shattered. And Damon, he stood before her, powerful, untouched, the moonlight casting an eerie glow against his dark form. He had done this. Her jaw clenched, But she didn't move. There was nothing left to fight with. No dagger, no strength. Just a hollow ache in her chest and the unbearable weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. Damon crouched in front of her, his presence a force of its own, suffocating. You were never meant to win. The words slithered into her bones, cold and absolute. Isla squeezed her eyes shut, as if that would make it stop, as if she could block out the truth. She had fought so hard. And for what? To lose, to be here, broken, powerless, kneeling at the feet of the man who had stolen everything from her. His fingers brushed under her chin, tilting her face up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Do you finally see it? His voice was soft, almost gentle. This is where you belong, Isla. You've been fighting it all this time, but you were never meant to be my equal. You were meant to be mine. Her breath hitched, a raw, ragged sound. A choice. That was what he was offering. She could surrender. She could stop fighting. If she went with him now, he would let her live. He would put her back in the place she had once longed for. Damon's Luna, his perfect mate. But not as an equal. Never as an equal. For the first time, Isla considered it. Maybe she wasn't strong enough. Maybe all this time she had been clinging to something impossible, trying to be a warrior when she was never meant to be one. Maybe it would be easier to stop fighting. Her body swayed forward, exhaustion making her limbs heavy. Then a voice. Not Damon's. Not Mora's. Something older, something vast. You are more than this. Her breath shuddered. The world seemed to still. Damon's hand tightened on her chin, his golden eyes searching hers. Isla swallowed. And then, for the first time since she had fallen, she lifted her head. She was not done yet. Underscore, 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 underscore. The walls of the dungeon pressed in too tightly. The cold stone beneath Isla's bare skin sent a chill through her bones. But it was nothing compared to the hollowness inside her. She was back in Silverfang's stronghold, caged. Her wrists ached where the iron shackles had bitten into them, her body sore and battered from the fight, if it could even be called a fight. She had been crushed, defeated, dragged here like a prisoner. She let her head rest back against the damp stone, closing her eyes. This was it. She had failed. A shaky breath left her lips. She had been so stupid. Thinking she could win. Thinking she could stand against someone like Damon and walk away victorious. She was never a warrior. Just a wolf playing pretend. Her pack had been right about her. A bitter laugh scraped its way up her throat. She had spent her whole life trying to prove she was strong enough, worthy enough. But in the end, she had only ever been fighting for a place in someone else's world. Maybe she wasn't meant to be anything more than his Luna. Her fingers curled against the ground. Something cold brushed against her fingertips. Isla stilled. Slowly she reached down, her fingers wrapping around something familiar. Metal. A dagger. Her heart lurched. Mora's dagger. Her breath caught, her grip tightening. Mora's words whispered through her mind. Power is not given, it is claimed. The weight in her chest shifted. For the first time since the battle, something other than despair sparked inside her. She was not done, not yet. The heavy silence of the dungeon pressed in on Isla like a second set of chains. She sat against the damp stone wall, Mora's dagger clutched in her hands, staring at the flickering torchlight outside her cell. The walls smelled of rust and cold, the air thick with the weight of failure. She had been ready to fight, ready to win, and yet here she was, trapped, defeated, her grip tightened around the dagger's worn hilt. Then footsteps, slow, measured. A key scraped in the lock, and the iron door groaned open. Isla lifted her head, expecting one of Damon's warriors, another cruel reminder of her place. Instead, Kai. Bruised, bloodied, smirking like they weren't standing in the belly of the beast. Well, You look like hell, princess. A sharp laugh burst from her before she could stop it. The sound was foreign, as if her body had forgotten how to make it. Kai stepped closer, tilting his head. No snarky comeback, now I'm worried. She huffed, looking away. His smirk softened. We're not done yet. The words sent a shiver through her. She turned back to him, eyes searching his face. The rebels? Still fighting. He crouched in front of her, resting his forearms on his knees. Cassian's alive, banged up but alive. Mora... He hesitated, rubbing his jaw. She's missing. A lump rose in Isla's throat. But, Kai continued, she left a message for you. Isla blinked. What? Kai's grin was sharp. The final trial awaits. Something settled in her chest. Not dread. Not fear. Purpose. Kai tapped her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. You are not some broken Luna, he said, voice firm. You are a goddamn silver wolf. Now act like it. The air seemed to shift. Isla took a slow, deep breath. The dagger in her grip pulsed, as if it had been waiting for her to wake up. She wasn't done. Not yet. Underscore, 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 underscore. The corridors of Silverfang's stronghold stretched in eerie corridor of Silverfang's stronghold stretched in eerie silence, broken only by the distant murmur of guards outside. Isla and Kai moved through the shadows, their steps sure, their breathing steady. This time, she didn't hesitate. When a guard rounded the corner, she struck first, her dagger cutting through the air in one swift motion. Not reckless, not desperate, calculated. Kai whistled under his breath as the body hit the floor. Remind me to never piss you off. They reached the armory within minutes. Kai shoved open the door, and Isla's breath caught. At the far end of the room, standing tall against the torchlight, her mother's armor. Black leather, reinforced with silver plates. It had been kept in pristine condition, as if waiting for her return. She stepped forward, running her fingers over the chest plate. This was more than revenge, more than Damon. This fight had always been bigger than her. With steady hands, she fastened the armor in place. The moment the last strap tightened, something inside her clicked into place. The energy within her no longer fought, no longer burned out of control. It flowed with her. She exhaled. Kai grinned. Damn, you look like someone about to end a tyrant. Isla tightened her grip on her blade. Cassian's waiting outside the city, Kai said. This is our last shot before Damon locks his hold on the pack. Isla nodded. Then let's finish this. They stepped into the moonlight. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Damon knew she was coming. The Silverfang's stronghold was burning. Smoke curled into the night sky, and the air was thick with the scent of blood and battle. Wolves clashed in the courtyard, their snarls and cries echoing through the stone walls. The rebels fought hard, their desperation turning them into something feral, but Damon's warriors were disciplined, ruthless. This was not an easy fight. But Isla hadn't come here for easy. She moved like a shadow, her blade cutting through the chaos as she fought her way toward the highest peak of the fortress. Every strike was precise, every movement controlled. She no longer hesitated, she no longer doubted, because this was what it had always been leading to, her final confrontation, with him. She found him standing at the top of the fortress, waiting. Damon. The moon bathed him in silver light, his golden eyes locked onto hers the moment she stepped onto the stone platform. For a moment, there was only silence. The world around them faded, the war below nothing but a distant hum. It had always been them, the Alpha and his Luna, the predator and his defiant prey. Damon exhaled, shaking his head. You should have stayed down. Isla lifted her blade. You should have killed me when you had the chance. His jaw tightened. I never wanted to kill you. No, she said, voice cold. You wanted to own me. A muscle in his jaw twitched. You were mine. Rage pulsed through her, but it was no longer wild, no longer something that controlled her. It was sharp, Steady. Hers. I was never yours. Damien's golden eyes burned. Then he moved. Their battle was nothing like before. He was stronger, but she was faster, more controlled. The power inside her no longer fought against her, it answered her. Steel clashed against steel, their movements blurring together in a deadly rhythm. Every strike, every dodge, every counter. This was years in the making. She had been trained to stand beside him. Now she was fighting to stand against him. Damien's rage exploded as he pressed forward, his attacks more vicious, more desperate. "You should have been my Luna," he snarled, blood dripping from a gash on his cheek. Isla didn't hesitate. "You should have been a better Alpha." Her blade slashed across his ribs, drawing a sharp hiss from his lips. Damien stumbled, chest heaving, his golden eyes burning with something between fury and twisted admiration. Then, a smirk. Blood dripped from his mouth as he straightened, gripping his blade tighter. "Then let's see if you can kill me." The world blurred at the edges. Isla's breath came in ragged gasps, her arms trembling as she struggled to keep her footing. Blood dripped down her temple, her body screaming from the relentless assault. Damien should have been weakening. He should have been breaking under the weight of his wounds, but instead he was getting stronger. Dark energy pulsed around him, thick and suffocating. His golden eyes burned brighter, his body brimming with something unnatural, something twisted. The power curled around her, sinking into her bones like poison. It was ancient, something deeper than just strength, something wrong. She lunged again, her blade aiming for his ribs, but before she could land the strike, he was there, faster than he had ever been. His hand slammed into her chest. The impact stole the breath from her lungs. She hit the ground hard, the stone beneath her cracking. A sharp cry tore from her throat as pain splintered through her ribs. Before she could move, before she could even breathe, Damien was on top of her, his clawed hand pressing against her throat. His grip was unrelenting, his power wrapping around her like a cage. "You will always belong to me." The words slithered into her mind, sinking their claws in deep. Not a promise, a curse. Her vision darkened at the edges. No. She had come too far for this. But her body was failing. The power he wielded was too much, pressing her deeper and deeper into the cold stone. She couldn't break free. A choked sound escaped her lips. For the first time since this fight began, true panic clawed its way up her throat. Was this it? Had it all been for nothing? Then, a thought, clear, cutting through the haze. It was never about being stronger than him. Her breath shuddered. She had been fighting to win, fighting to beat him, but this wasn't about winning, it was about breaking free. Damien's grip tightened, his lips curling into something victorious, but Isla's fingers were already moving, reaching, searching, until they closed around the silver dagger. Mora's dagger, the weapon meant to end this. Her heart pounded. This was it. With the last ounce of strength left in her body, she struck. The moment stretched, frozen in time. Damien loomed over her, golden eyes burning with certainty. His grip tightened around her throat, his power pressing into her skin like an iron brand. She felt it slithering through her veins, trying to drown her, trying to own her. He had won. Except he hadn't. Because for the first time in her life, Isla let go. Not of the fight, not of survival. She let go of fear. A slow exhale left her lips, her grip on Mora's dagger tightened, and then she struck. The blade found its mark, sinking into Damien's chest. Not with desperate strength, not with rage or hatred, but with something greater. Power surged through her, silver light bursting from the dagger's hilt, racing through her veins, filling the air with a pulsing. Damien gasped. His golden eyes went wide. For the first time since this all began, since he had hunted her, caged her, tried to break her, there was no arrogance, no certainty, only shock. His lips parted, breath rattling in his chest. "This was never your curse," he whispered. His knees buckled, his grip on her going slack. "It was mine." Then he fell, lifeless, the air stilled. And just like that, it was over. The moment Damien hit the ground, The battlefield shifted. His warriors faltered, their cohesion shattered. The rebels surged forward, overpowering what was left of the Silverfang forces. The war that had felt impossible was ending. Isla forced herself to breathe, staring down at his body. She had won. She had broken free. And yet, a hollow ache settled in her chest. She should feel triumphant, victorious. Instead, all she felt was the weight of everything that had led her here, the blood on her hands. The past she had buried, the future that now stretched before her unknown. The wind howled through the ruins of the stronghold, carrying the scent of ash and moonlight. Isla lifted her head. The battle was over, but her story was just beginning. The rebel camp still stood, barely. Smoke curled into the early evening sky, and the scent of war still clung to the air. Blood, sweat, grief. Victory had come at a cost. The dead were counted. The wounded tended to. The living tried to remember how to breathe again. There were smiles, laughter even, but it was muted, the kind that didn't quite reach the eyes. Isla stood at the edge of it all, watching. Cassian clapped a hand on Kai's back, both of them bruised but standing. Rebels sat in clusters, sharing what food they had, passing flasks between them. They had won. They had survived. But Isla had never felt more like a ghost. Her feet carried her away from the camp before she could think better of it. She walked alone, past the wreckage of the battlefield, past the broken walls of the stronghold, until she reached the place where Damon had been buried. No grand tomb, no ornate headstone, just a mound of earth. She stared down at it, the wind rustling through the trees. He had been a monster, but he had also been the boy she once loved. That was the cruelest part. Because love had never been enough to save them. She knelt, fingers pressing into the dirt. "I don't forgive you," she whispered, "but I don't hate you anymore." The wind carried her words away. She rose, exhaling, leaving the past where it belonged. Back at camp, Cassian found her first. "The Silverfang pack is leaderless," he said, arms crossed. "They need an alpha." She knew what he was going to say before he said it. "You should take it," she smiled. Small, knowing. "I was never meant to rule over others." Cassian tilted his head. "And what were you meant to be?" She glanced at the horizon, where the moon was beginning to rise. "Free." A breeze swept through the camp, cool and steady. The war was over, but her journey had only just begun. The wind tasted like freedom. Isla stood at the edge of the world she had fought for, where rolling hills met an endless sky. The land before her stretched wide and wild, untouched by the past she had left behind. She was no longer a Luna, no longer an outcast. She was simply Isla. She inhaled deeply, feeling the power thrumming beneath her skin. Not something to be feared or contained, but something. The silver wolf had always been inside her, waiting. Now it was her. No pack, no mate, no chains. She had spent her whole life searching for where she belonged, and at last she had found it. Within herself. A rustle behind her. She didn't startle. She had sensed them before they even approached. Kai leaned casually against a tree, arms crossed, watching her. "So, where to next?" she smirked. "You act like you have a choice." He grinned, pushing off the trunk. "I do have a choice. I'm just smart enough to know that wherever you go, trouble follows and someone has to keep you from dying. Admit it," she teased. "You'd be bored without me." Kai let out an exaggerated sigh. You're exhausting." But he was smiling. So was she. A howl echoed in the distance, not one of war, not one of loss, but of something new. Possibility. She turned toward the horizon, the wind at her back, her heart steady. Whatever came next, whoever came next, let them. She was ready.